Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm really excited about the topic we're going to be talking about. And what that topic would be, of course, Joseph Smith, one of my favorite characters, if you will, of Mormonism. As a matter of fact, it's the architect of Mormonism. But before we get there, I would like to actually just remind people that I have an extra copy of The Rise and Fall of the American Prophet, Joseph Smith by John G. Turner. And I was nice enough to get two copies. And so we're going to have a book drawing for this book. And so just go, I'll have a link in the description, but it's basically just send it to mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. Put in the subject heading Joseph Smith or JS book giveaway. Make sure you give me your name and address. And we'll be doing the drawing probably at mid-July. So make sure you are entered into this contest for this really good book with a really great person that I got to meet. And we're giving it away. And so we'll be doing a book drawing in the next week or so. But that leads to another book about Joseph Smith that I recently have had the privilege of receiving. It's called Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism, a Topical Biography by Ganesh Cherian. How are you doing today, sir?
Great, Steve. It's really nice to be with you, and yeah, really excited about spending the time because, gosh, we can talk and talk and talk and talk, of
Yes.
course, and I learned a great deal from you, and it's lots of fun.
Well, Ganesh is an active member in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He lives in New Zealand. He has spent a considerable amount of time in the United States as well. In around 2012, 2013, really started doing a deep dive in Mormon history. Of course, that's right around the time of the Gospel Topics essays. And so he's been kind of doing this self-taught thing where he's autodidactic process of trying to understand Mormonism and its history. And this accumulates into this really interesting book that he's put together. Before we actually start about the talk about the book, Ganesh, I'd actually it's really fascinating to me because I'm really interested in like interfaith stuff and stuff like that. And I think that your name is very fascinating because it's a very unique name, but both the first and last names are a combination that's quite interesting. And you were telling me on the phone the other day about that. I want you to give a little bit about your parents' religious history and the world that you were born into and how you got that unique name.
Sure. It is fascinating. My mother is from New Zealand. She's a European, mostly British descent, and she went traveling as a young adult throughout Australia and then into Asia and ended up in India. And of course, this was the early 70s, so it was a big, India was a mecca for um, hippies of the time, trying to find enlightenment through spirituality and Eastern philosophy. And of course, the Beatles at the time were, following a guru. Lots of people, India was accessible and amazing and wonderful. And she ended up there and met my father in the north of India. And I was conceived, and my mother was from a very Anglican Church of England background, but not overly committed. And my father was from a South Indian, very staunch Christian background, but he had, left his home and a terrible relationship with his father to board with an uncle who was an Episcopalian minister, also kind of Church of England, and ended up, at a Hindu university in Varanasi or Banaras. And that's where my parents met, and I was conceived and I was born there, and they were following a guru at the time. So when they asked for, they sent to their guru a telegram. That's how that dates me as a person, that there was such a thing. And the guru sent back a telegram. I still have it, that says, call his name Ganesh G. So Ganesh is the Hindu god of prosperity and wisdom, very favored god. And G is a sign of respect, an honorarium like Sir. So like, Sir Ganesh. And then this kind of upset my grandparents, particularly my dad's family, because they were staunch Christians, and having their grandchild, great, their nephew's son being called Ganesh was a real upset to the family because Ganesh is very Hindu. Cherian, my last name, is derived from an Armenian name. So the Armenians came and settled in South India, and brought a form of Christianity, Orthodox, into South India, and so lots of the people in South India have these very strong, centuries old Christian roots, and Cherian is one of those very very prominent Christian names in South India. So I'm the only Ganesh Cherian in the world because it's kind of like calling your son Muhammad Jesus. That's the connotation. So it makes me very unique, which as a child was painful because I'd always have to say my name and explain it and everything like that. But as an adult, I'm the only Ganesh most people know, and I'm certainly the only Ganesh Cherian in the world. So I'm easy to Google and find that I've written a book and purchase it on Amazon.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Actually, it's pretty easy to find Google Meet too. There aren't a whole lot. I mean, there are Pynakkers, but probably one of the best known Pynakkers in the world. So it's easy to find Meet as well. But I think it's really important that your parents, in one sense, were kind of like religious seekers. This was a period of time of great upheaval in the early 70s. This was the movement of course, you had the Jesus People movement that was going on in the evangelical world, which is also getting a lot of hippies involved. It's very much a world in which everything's kind of unsettled, and it's you're on the frontier, if you will, going out there and trying to find yourself. And it reminds me of this young 14-year-old boy who's also a religious seeker, who's trying to find out what church he should go to, and that question essentially starts a major American religion of which you would be born into, because eventually your parents would convert to Mormonism. And so that gets the whole ball rolling. So, in one sense, Joseph Smith had a huge impact on your life, as it has for millions and millions of people. And of course, his Book of Mormon has been spread and distributed throughout the world. And it's a remarkable document. And I think it's really important. I just want to read something you put in the intro here that I really appreciated. And this is the takeaway that you would hope that readers of this book would have. At the end, I hope you come away with a deep appreciation for the extraordinary life of Joseph Smith. He was remarkable and his life worthy of examination. I have endeavored to evidence him as a complete person with imagination, drive, desire, pain, relationship, and innovation. It's not always pretty, but it is fascinating and a life we can all learn from. And that's really, I think, what you say is the takeaway you want people to take from this book. And that's the approach that you took to it. I think so often Joseph is, unfortunately, there's been this long Kendall image of Joseph Smith. And I think that Joseph Smith was a human being just like you and I. Whether you think this is Joseph Smith or not, and I believe that it most likely is, Joseph, whether this is him or not, Joseph looked a lot more like this person than the Kendall image that a lot of people grew up with. And I think that
Yes,
that's so
yes.
important, even talking with John G. Turner about his book, is the humanity of Joseph Smith, and that he is just like us, and so capable of doing a lot great good, but also capable of doing bad, which we all are capable in our lives. And I think that's really the approach to take. What do you say about that, Ganesh?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what I found as I've gone through. Because of course, this book is to answer the question, or my question, and I think it's a question that lots of members of the church have as they grapple with a much more complex Joseph. Is how did I not know about this more complex Joseph, and what do I do now that I know some of the really tricky things about him? How do I how do I come to terms with that? And so you know, hopefully, as people read this book, and they will get a a much more broad understanding of Joseph. That he did. He was innovative. He was interested in other people. He did do some incredibly, kind things. But he also took advantage and furthered his own interests, and took liberties, and that's just how his life played out. Some of that is because he was poor and marginalized, and he was trying to just survive. And then once he got resources, sometimes that that power meant that he used that to further his own needs at the expense of others. And that's a very common story, I think, of people in general. But it certainly is a feature of his life. And, once you understand that and maybe see him, I hope people would have huge empathy, but also that they would hold him to account. Because I think, like you said about the Ken doll image, is that when you've got this person on a pedestal and you can't either, he's some figure close to deity, then that is not a very healthy relationship. You end up doing terrible things because you think that that person is worthy of your allegiance and uh, defense, when actually um, there's a lot of things that he should be made accountable for in our own lives, even in 2025, because his legacy went on to underpin lots of things that happened in the church, but also lots of tough things that happen in people's lives today. So um, those are the kinds of things I hope. Maybe it's a bridge, right? That members of the church who may have that Ken doll image of Joseph will be able to appreciate that some people might have a real exception to him. And also for those people who have been heartbroken or felt betrayed because they've learned of a much more complex Joseph, that they'll be able to go, gosh, I understand how this came about, and I have a lot of empathy for that, and I can let go of the fact that this person had a major impact in my life, and my life might have been even hijacked by um, his philosophies or the ways that people have interpreted his essence. So, if anything, I hope for healing. That anybody reads this book, that they are more compassionate, more empathetic, uh, more able to talk to the other the other side than prior. So yeah, we'll
Okay.
see, I guess.
Well, I want you to explain. So, what is you say it's a topical biography? So, I'd like for you to explain what is a topical biography and what was the approach that you were taking with this book to make it a topical biography, and how would you like the reader to engage this book?
So one of the things that when I had to grapple with a more complex Joseph uh, over a number of different issues, right? The way that I did that in the past was to examine one thing and track it through the history of the church. Maybe its beginnings in early 19th century America, the environment that was there. How did this impact the Smith family? What did it mean for Joseph and his personal circumstance? What does it look like in the Book of Mormon? What about in the early church structure? And then what does it look like in Nauvoo? And maybe even what it looks like today. So I'm a kind of person who, you know, we, and we've had this discussion slightly, that the kinds of things that really tipped me over the edge for understanding a more complex Joseph was violence and racism. Uh, and so those two things are things that I had to really grapple with. Oh gosh, this is much more complex than I imagined. And I had to in order to understand it, I just had to break it down into its component parts and its chronology so that I could get an, so I could understand why things are the way they are because of what has happened in the past. And so the way that this biography came about, and it wasn't really a biography to begin with. It was really just an explanation of the Book of Mormon. Back a few years ago, I watched William Davis's, Sunstone presentation because it was COVID and you had to see it online. Of course, I live in New Zealand, so I don't get to go to those things very often. And he made the point that the Book of Mormon was a piece of performance, that Joseph was performing the Book of Mormon, and that was revolutionary to me. And once I saw that, I could see that there were ways that was the case. And Around the same time, Dan McClellan was becoming big on TikTok with his biblical criticism. And he didn't say much about Mormonism, but when he did, he described the Book of Mormon particularly as a 19th century work, and that if you wanted to understand it, you need to look at it as a piece of 19th century literature. And so those two ideas, got in my head, and I started to think about some of the issues that the Book of Mormon presented, particularly those ones for which the what the church in Nauvoo and kind of pretty much now were different from the Book of Mormon. I could see that there were things that were happening in Joseph's life that seemed to indicate that the Book of Mormon was his ideas at 23 years old, and Nauvoo was his development and maturity and place in the world when he's 38 years old. And these are quite different people because of the circumstances which have happened in between those two things. And so when I started to write down a few of those observations, I had these two big data points, the Book of Mormon and Nauvoo, and I looked at the contrast, and then I tried to understand how these things went from one to the other. And I came up with a few things that I thought would be a great article. I liked writing about these kinds of things. It helped me to understand the world and Mormonism and to make sense of some of the disparities and contradictions. And so I started writing, and then I found more, and I just kept finding more and more and more of these things. And the way to explain them was to explain them in terms of this trajectory of this is the environment that Joseph was in, this is the family dynamics, this is Joseph's personal circumstance, this is what's written in the Book of Mormon, this is the early church and what the people were trying to grapple with. And then there's some kind of pivot point, a place where Joseph's idealism as a 23-year-old, early, young adult, comes up against reality, and he has to change. And sometimes those are pretty tough circumstances, like Jackson County, Missouri, or Kirtland Bank scandal, or just all of these things. And these were big pivot points where he just had to make a major change, and there were these big changes led to what we have in Nauvoo. So, yeah, I just started writing, found more and more, and then this became a biography, because the only way to explain all of these differences was Joseph. So you had to look at Joseph in order to explain them, and then the same thing was true, that all of these things explained where Joseph was at that particular time. And so it became a biography, and it's a topical biography because, of course, each chapter is broken up into topics and tracks that trajectory through his life just on that particular point. And there's 5 sections. So early settler understandings of America, 2 Native Americans, 3 theology, so the ways that people were thinking about religion in Joseph Smith's time and how they played out through to the unique doctrines that are now the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints. And then his own prejudices that I think were present in his own life because of his circumstances that changed because his circumstances changed. And then his magic worldview, the way that his esoteric understanding of the world influenced his thinking and the ways that he believed that God operated. And that is basically what the book is. And so the great news about that is that for anybody reading it, it is in some relative order. It goes from the more broad things like what are other 19th century early Americans thinking about these subjects, through to the magic world worldview, which is really specific to Joseph's family and his New England refugee status in Western New York. And so there's an order, you can read it in order, but there's also you can also popcorn it, right? It's choose your own adventure. You can go, oh, this is a subject that's important to me. What can I understand from reading this? And you can choose a few topics that maybe are really key to you, because, like I said, violence and racism were big push button topics for me early on. And other topics have become bigger over time. But there are certainly lots of topics in here that I hadn't even thought about. That once I started talking to other people, I realized these were big issues for others, and I was totally oblivious to them. So hopefully, you read, you you try a few of those tough subjects which you are really engaged in, and then you branch out and go, oh gosh, what about this? Using the same model helps to explain the trajectory and also gives you a grounding for being able to take on the information without it being overwhelming. Because, gosh, there's so much, and I could have written 10 more chapters, but because there are other aspects which either I didn't have quite the full information or I couldn't quite make all of those points stick. So they got left out.
Yeah. Well, and I think I want to kind of talk a little bit about because I think one of the most interesting things about Joseph Smith and the Restoration is really, in many ways, it's the early days, especially with the Book of Mormon, and also another area that really is fascinating to me, coming from a charismatic slash Pentecostalish background, is to see the gifts fully operational in the church in early days. And it reminds me of my good friend Dr. Christopher Thomas, who wrote the book A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon, um, how Pentecostal the Book of Mormon is as well, even more than people would have expected, reading it from the perspective
Yeah,
of
yeah.
a Pentecostal theologian's eyes. And I just wanted to, there's this move coming that's kind of interesting to me, and there's some pretty prominent people and scholars that I'm surprised are actually starting to embrace the idea that Joseph Smith did not write the Book of Mormon, but it was somebody else. I'd like for you to address that question. Do you believe that Joseph Smith was the author of the Book of Mormon, or do you believe that he was fronting for somebody else, that he was merely some kind of cipher? Um, I'm very fascinated by that. I'm of the mind, like from a naturalistic perspective. Again, folks, I acknowledge the supernatural as a Christian, but we're going to talk more naturalistically on in this question. Is there are people who are starting to think that in early days people didn't think Joseph was capable of writing this book, and now in the 21st century there's people that are saying that. Where do you fall on that?
So my book is, Joseph is Mormonism and Mormonism is Joseph. Like that's the total premise. I mean, this is a biography because whenever I looked at anything, when I looked at the Book of Mormon, when I looked at Nauvoo, when I looked at anything in between, when I looked at prior to the Book of Mormon, or I looked at prior to Nauvoo, after Nauvoo, you know, all I find is Joseph, like
Okay.
everywhere. You know, I mean, there is Joseph and Sydney, or there's Joseph and Oliver, or there's Joseph and Hiram, but there's never Hiram and Oliver, and there's never. Well, actually, that's not quite true, but it's the Joseph is the linchpin in everything that's going on.
Including
So
basically, so you're of the mind that Joseph Smith was perfectly capable of creating the Book of Mormon on his own, with maybe getting also absorbing as a sponge the different influences of his time as well.
absolutely, and I think that the text clearly shows that. And I do 45 chapters that basically show that not only is this information in Joseph's world, like because it's in his environment, but this is what's happening to his family. This is what is happening to him. It's not just that he's speaking about something esoteric out there in the world, or something that's divorced from him. The reason why the Book of Mormon is so uh, important to people, why it captures them, I think, is because the ways that these issues are talked about in the Book of Mormon are important to Joseph in the moment. So that's why it feels so real, because even though he might be employing fictional characters to play out these ideas, the ideas are core to his belief system. I mean, there's some that he's adopting because the scribe and the audience that he's among while the dictation is going on. That's certainly happening. And I think you can distinctly see that in the text. But these are oftentimes these are really core beliefs of him, or the things that he's really internalized at the moment that that the Book of Mormon is being created. Because I think we can see that at least the text also shows that there are some things that he wasn't that interested in that becomes very interesting or important to him to write down in the moment at the point of the Book of Mormon, and then those things might carry through to the early church, but then there's some point down the road where he has to change a pivot point, and actually he manages to swing quite sometimes exact opposite. So it becomes a bit of a contradiction. And I think that's got to do with him and the way that he's interpreting and internalizing the information, and then he's changing as his needs change.
Okay.
So
And just
I can't find the thing is I can't find anybody else.
okay.
Like I look and I look at the Book of Mormon particularly, and all I see is Joseph and the relationships that he has, and all of the characters in the Book of Mormon are put him first, like Nephi is first, and Joseph is Nephi, right? And Mosiah has primacy, and Mosiah is Joseph, and Alma is, you know, it's Alma and Amulek, sure, but it's Alma is the main guy, and Amulek's the sidekick, right? Alma is Joseph. The Mormon is Joseph. So there's whenever I'm looking at the text and I see the other characters, they're all subordinate to the character that most represents Joseph.
Hmm. And that's okay. That's interesting. And I'm just also curious. I'm assuming that you go along with the Mosiah priority, with the dictation of
Yeah,
Mormon.
absolutely. And I think that the Brett Metcalf has done an incredible job there. Yeah, and he wasn't the first to promote it, but he really developed it where it became a part of popular understanding and historical understanding. And I think I furthered that work a little bit by suggesting that there are things that are features in the text which can only happen because they're Mosiah priorities. So, um, and that Joseph is developing even as the Book of Mormon is being created. Because like William Davis has talked about. The Book of Mormon is a performance. Joseph is performing this, and there is an audience. There's an immediate audience. The immediate audience is his scribe and the household that he's in, and those are having an impact on the text because as he's performing, he is seeing their reaction, maybe hearing their reaction later when they get to read what has just been dictated, and then he's using that for the next scene. I mean, he has an outline. I can absolutely show that he's got an outline and that he's following a script. It's obviously memorized, but he's influenced in the moment by the audience participation and reaction and how they're dealing with the text. He then incorporates into his next act, his next performance. And so the Book of Mormon's dynamic. It's not all planned out and then written. That's why there's no manuscript. There's no Spalding manuscript. Um, there's no. He's got ideas. He's got storylines. He's memorized them, so he knows what points he needs to hit. But this is dynamic because as a performance, the audience share in the ideas, give him new ideas for the next day or the next week of addressing that. And that's I show that over and over and over again in the text. So that's part of the book, but
Okay.
I'm trying
That's
to do ideas more than that.
that's a really interesting uh, thought there because whenever I think of the reception history of scriptures, it's always the initial audience is the most important audience. Now, when I'm thinking of the initial audience of the Book of Mormon, I'm thinking of the audience of the completed Book of Mormon that he's then going to birth out and send out to the world. But
Yeah,
what you're
published
saying
the published Book
actually
of Mormon, right? Yeah,
but actually the very first audience were the scribes and the people in the household and people that he was interacting with. And so that's an insight there that I'd never thought of before. And I think that's really a key thing there that his an audience was really there in real time as this is being produced. Whether you think this is all man-made or this is being literally something is appearing and he's reading it off, it's interesting to think that first of all it's an oral thing before it's written down, and so you got through that lens as well. But he's also engaging the audience that's actually there present with the various scribes and people that might be around.
We can see that in the text, and we can see that with
Give
the
an example. Give an
Messiah.
example of that where you can see that in the text.
Well, the best example and the easiest to show really is anti-Catholicism, right? The anti-Catholicism only happens in Fayette. So, once Joseph moves from Harmony to Fayette, that's when the anti-Catholic rhetoric comes in. Mormon, um, Moroni, First and Second Nephi. These are all of these anti-Catholic sentiments start to appear in the Book
And
of Mormon.
just so the audience understands, when you say anti-Catholic sentiments, what's an example? Give some examples of what those look like in the Book of Mormon. I know what they
So
would
so
explain to the
um,
audience.
the the paying for indulgences, the infant baptism, the idea that the Catholic Church has corrupted the Scriptures, the idea that the Catholic Church is a great and abominable church. Uh, these ideas only come up when Joseph has moved from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, which suggests that these are, are by interacting with the Whitmers and their German Protestant background, which, if you think about what's happening in Germany in the 16th and 17th century between the Catholics and Protestants, there are
Yes.
wars going on
Yes.
and a lot of
Yes.
major battles that are happening in Germany, huge. Um, and so there's a really big divide between Catholic
Okay.
Germans
And I
and
think that's
Protestant Germans.
and I just want the audience to understand this too, is that I come from a long line of Dutch Reformed people from both sides of the family. And in the 20th century, my grandmother was teaching my younger sister anti-papist nursery rhymes. So this
Yeah,
idea that there would be anti-Catholicism, yes, America at this time was a highly anti-Catholic society. It was very Protestant oriented and did have deep concerns about a Catholic invasion in this country, which would later become another political party, the American Party or the Know Nothing Party, a few decades later. And so you have this idea of anti-Catholicism did exist certainly during this period of time. So what you're saying is Joseph is exposed, maybe exposed or having a conversation with the Whitmers and starts integrating that into the text of the Book of Mormon. Is that what you're saying?
that's what I'm saying. And like I don't think Joseph is anti-Catholic himself, right? He may not have even met a Catholic, and so he's aware of the anti-Catholic sentiment which is in his environment. New York was the hotbed of anti-Catholic rhetoric and expression. So, but it's not. But the fact that the anti-Catholic material in the Book of Mormon doesn't come up in the dictation sequence till Joseph gets to Fayette is a tell. It's a tell that you know that the audience is having an impact on the text. It's going in Joseph's ear and it's coming out Joseph's mouth. And of course, that's genius because, of course, when the Whitmers are hearing their prejudices being parroted in the Book of Mormon, they it makes them believe it's true because it's really confirming their biases, and so it's emotive by this point, right?
Mm.
So and then you see this continue in the early church because there are some anti-Catholic sections of Revelation, and these happen to also coincide with when the Whitmers are in the room, as part of this revelation. So um, this is all a big deal. But in my chapter actually in about anti-Catholicism, I detail all this. But also, what happens is that Joseph ends up in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1836, doing a bit of touring, and he comes across a burnt Catholic convent and is moved by their plight. And he identifies with it with regard to Jackson County, Missouri, and his feelings about Catholics flip. Now, the Whitmers are soon kicked out of the church in 1838. So in Nauvoo, Catholics are celebrated in the Nauvoo city charter. They're celebrated in Joseph's sermons. Like he does a complete flip about Catholics. So, yeah, these are just really interesting tells that, Joseph is listening to his audience and giving them what they want. Also, it's influencing him, right? Because I think he's just taking on board their prejudices. But he's got his own trajectory, and he has some moments where he actually flips on this. And so, anti-Catholic sentiment is not in Nauvoo, although it gets picked up by Orson Pratt later, and also then Bruce R. McConkie later. So it becomes a big part of the LDS Church for a long time. But in terms of Joseph's life, we don't see any exhibits of anti-Catholic material prior to Fayette, and he changes quite dramatically by Nauvoo.
By Nauvoo period. Okay. Now, during this time, of course, this is the translation process. And of course, we have these objects, um, plates, and we also have spectacles. What's interesting is it seemed that Joseph was more interested in those spectacles than the plates initially. I want you to kind of tackle what your thoughts are on what the plates were. Again, this is naturalistic. Like, okay, if there's no God, there's no angels, there's no supernatural. How do we account for the plates? And of course, I had this conversation with others as well as with Richard Bushman and with his book. And I just want to kind of get your sense of what were the plates? What were the spectacles? What's your thought on that?
So I think that there are a number of things going on at the same time, and one of the tricky things about unraveling it is that we don't have any things that have. Look, Joseph didn't write anything prior to the Book of Mormon. He just didn't. It may well have been that Joseph was so poor that paper and ink were prohibitive, right? So he didn't write a journal, he didn't keep a journal. So all we have is reminiscence from other people about those events, and then their interpretation of those events sometime later. So one of the things you start to realize pretty quickly is that the kinds of ways that Lucy Mack, for instance, in 1845, talks about these beginnings of the Book of Mormon are quite different to how the story plays out later. That the it's not a glorious angel coming to deliver the plates to Joseph that we kind of talk about today. When Lucy talks about it, she talks about Joseph going to this guardian, right, and not doing the right things, and the guardian shocking him and throwing him back and and um and berating him for not doing the right thing, to have to come back, with certain requirements which he can't fulfill, and therefore he doesn't retrieve the plates for 4 years, right? That's quite a different story than there's a beautiful angel who's tutoring him year after year after year to receive his prophetic mantle so that he can translate the book. So the spectacles and are part of this. So Samuel Lawrence talks about a reminiscence of when Joseph has asked him to validate this treasure, these gold plates under the ground, and Samuel Lawrence, it seems like they're having a discussion in their mind's eye, in their potentially their seer stones, describing events almost like as if you're trying to one up somebody. And so Samuel Lawrence talks about the spectacles, and the spectacles for Joseph. The only other person that really talks about those is Lucy Mack Smith. And so it's the idea of this next step, right? Because everybody's got a seer stone, and Joseph has a seer stone. Sam Lawrence has a seer stone. Actually, lots of people do. David Whitmer has a seer stone. Hiram Page has a seer stone. These are just part of the the wider folk magic understandings of people. Joseph Smith Senior likely had a seer stone. He certainly had dowsing rods. Oliver Cowdery had dowsing rods. These are just parts of what was going on. So in terms of the spectacles, that was a way of kind of making palatable the idea of seer stones to a future church membership that didn't understand seer stones. So what we have is that Joseph is using a seer stone. He's absolutely, that's how he is accessing the plates, actually, because he's using the seer stones to remote view. And we know this because, of course, when he leaves Fayette, so when he leaves Harmony, Pennsylvania to go to Fayette, he does not take the plates with him. There are no plates in Fayette. Whatever the plates are, if it's a prop or it's treasure or it's some ancient record, whatever it is, he does not have it in Fayette. And to the Whitmers, this is not a problem whatsoever. They have a seer stone. David Whitmer has a seer stone. Hiram Page has a seer stone. He's the Whitmer's son-in-law. They know about remote viewing. And Joseph has got a seer stone with him, right? So he's able to remote view the record wherever it is. Is it in Harmony, Pennsylvania? I don't know. Perhaps. Is it in Manchester, where he's originally got it? Perhaps. Is it still in the hill? Because this is just an esoteric feeling. Perhaps. We don't know. Did Joseph? I think Joseph felt some need to have some physical prop that gave people some assurance of its validity. But is he actually using them? Well, we know he doesn't. Emma Smith never sees these records. Whatever she's experiencing is never in her eye line, right? In Doctrine and Covenants, section 25, she's commanded to not murmur because she hasn't seen these things, right? Martin Harris never sees these things. He does the lost manuscript for 2 months from April to June in 1828. He never sees the plates. We know he doesn't because he keeps getting hassles from his wife, and he comes back in March of 1829 with the express desire to see the plates because he's never seen them. Joseph has told him about them, and maybe he's hefted something in a box, just like Isaac Hale attests to, but he's never seen them. The Whitmers, they've never seen them either because he doesn't bring them to Fayette. That's Oliver Cowdery. We don't know. He never kind of talks about this, of course, in any contemporary way. Of course, we have the witness statements from Martin Harrison and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer in June of 1829, but there's no indication to suggest that they actually felt hefted plates, because that at that particular moment it's a spiritual understanding and connection. So are there plates? I think that Joseph has some kind of physical representation of them that people are getting some information from. Are they actually seeing it? No. Or whatever they're seeing is so curated that it's really hard to tell exactly what they're seeing. Are they seeing it in their mind's eye? Are they feeling through a cloth the leaves of a tin prop? Are they hefting in a box a something metal or something just you know heavy. Like this, lots of that stuff is later put into some kind of really solid form. But at the time, if you look at it's close to the events reminiscences as possible. They seem very esoteric, very, very loose, very, contradictory. Like there's people are grappling with this, and later down the track, people are wanting to know, is this real? Like, did you feel them? Did you have them? And of course, by 1837, um, people are asking Martin Harris these very questions, to which he's going, well, I saw them like I see a city through a hill. I know it's there, and I've felt it's, it's nature. And they're going, that's not what we thought you said. And that's not what we thought from what reading the witness statements, that you're talking about some kind of, that's the way I know God. Yes, I know him so much. Has he appeared to you? No, but he couldn't. If he appeared to me, I wouldn't believe any more than what I currently do now. We use that same understanding of things now. So probably um, uh, what that looked like, really really difficult to ascertain for certain. We just have lots of guesses.
Well, this is very interesting, and I'm not really pushing back here because I really kind of want you to tell your story. I would love to get some faithful people to respond to this as well. Maybe we could even do like a panel discussion. I'd love to get Jonathan Neville involved in this conversation with you at some point as well, because I think he brings a lot of interesting ideas to the table. But today we're here to hear Ganesh's about his book and his take on things, and it's really important that we hear all these different perspectives and voices as well. Now, when I went on Mormon Stories a few years ago, I actually did a 3 hour presentation, if you will. It wasn't really a presentation. It was a 3 hour conversation I had with John DeLynn about how the Book of Mormon was created, and it was by far the most viewed video of the interview series that we did that week. And I heard back from a lot of different people who, and I said, listen, if there's no angels, there's no new supernatural, there is no God, how does one take into account, the Book of Mormon? And of course, when I had developed this model of the Book of Mormon, it was while I was very much an atheist. So I was viewing it from a purely naturalistic lens. How does one account for the Book of Mormon if there isn't a supernatural? Now, I will tell you, I could do a 6 hour thing on the Bible if I wanted to do deconstructing. But I also
Yeah,
want to say
sure.
that I want people to recognize that I am a person of faith and I do believe in God. And so I have to also cannot limit the idea that God could intervene in human affairs, including to a 14-year-old boy, is that's on the table as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to dismiss Joseph Smith and Mormonism from a believer's perspective. I think it's really important for me to be fair about that. But I also think it's really important that, again, folks, I deconstructed my own scriptures too. I deconstructed my own faith back in the day. And I tell people, it turns out God actually deconstructed me. But the thing is that, I really think it's important that we have these conversations and we do it in a civil way. So I go on Mormon Stories. I give a naturalistic explanation of the Book of Mormon. Again, it's just all off the top of my head, no notes, nothing, just kind of just having this conversation with John. And a lot of people said it was really like impactful for them to have that perspective from the Book of Mormon purely from an outsider's perspective. And one of the things I want to just maybe talk about with you is this idea that, I put this out there that Joseph, during the period of time where he was doing the treasure digging, that he was world building. And it seems like you kind of jumped on this, kind of made the same kind of conclusion as well with your book, which is that essentially the argument could be made that the original Book of Mormon geography essentially took place in the world that Joseph grew up in and knew. And arguably, then you could say that maybe the Book of Mormon geography expands after it's published while Joseph Smith's world expands. And I think you can see that with the expansion of wandering the plains of the Nephites, uh, the Zelph, the white Lamanite. I argue that Joseph was probably doing a similar thing with the treasure digging in New York. So he was world building for years before he actually puts pen to paper, or the scribes do. And so I think we kind of naturalistically, that's kind of the argument that we're making, and I'd like for you to kind of comment on that and give your what you some of the insights that you brought into this book as well.
So I would concur. I I, yeah, and that idea of world building, I think, is beautifully said because it's relatable today, right? Gosh, we're at the age where people did Dungeons and Dragons, right? That was, that's world building, right? If you think about, gosh, I grew up with Star Wars, that became a huge world that I participated in as a youth and into my adulthood. If you're into Marvel movies today, you're interested in building. Each of those movies connect a whole nother world into this grander world. And if your kids play Minecraft, they're engaged in world building. This is the way that we imagine these other ideas and their interactions with people. Star Trek is a great world to inhabit. One of the fabulous things about science fiction was that you could, and Star Trek is a really good example of this, of course, is that they could talk about ethical, dilemmas, and they did it as a TV show, right? You you talked about the idea that the Klingons were the evil other, and suddenly you had to grapple with the idea that Klingons liked their babies too, right? I mean, this was during the height of the Cold War when we were thinking that missiles might fly back and forth from the USSR and America, right? So that uh, world building is an incredibly powerful way that humans engage in uh, in living and um, and reframing their situation in positive ways. And look, Joseph was incredibly poor. So the idea of going out in the night, treasure digging, with the idea that there was this uh, esoteric, um, unseen world that he could participate in with treasured guardians who would move treasure under the ground, that there were spells and incantations that would trap the treasure so that you could dig and find it. This was adventure, it was entertainment, but it was also escapism, right? Joseph's life was pretty terrible. You know, they didn't have quite enough to eat. They were day laborers, which meant that they were subject to whatever was going for whatever amount was going, right? So it was pretty miserable, sometimes incredibly frustrating, and they were always on the brink of losing their house. Alvin, went off and got the money for the mortgage payment because Joseph Smith Senior just wasn't capable, and this meant huge amounts of uncertainty in Joseph's life. So, the idea that he was world building through his, magic, folk magic worldview, that's incredibly human. It's incredibly understandable for a young man trying to, be the hero in his world, where most of the time he was the lackey, the person that other people kicked around. So him being the treasure digger or leading treasure digs, him being the seer with a powerful seer stone, and him describing, to the others in his band what's happening under the ground. They can't see any of this, right? They're just feeling the effects. He's basically telling ghost stories. And we know that he can do this because he does this for his own family, for his own family's entertainment, as he describes the ancient inhabitants of America. So yes, as he is moving around, as he is participating in these digs, he is, sharing large stories about what's happening, what has happened, thousands of years ago that results in the fact that there is treasure sitting right here. So the idea of Palmyra and Manchester, where he's living, and then Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he meets and then eventually marries and then ends up living with his in-laws. These are really big, world building places for him, and they inhabit the Book of Mormon. So I make the case in the book, but that Palmyra, um, Manchester is Lehi Nephi, the land of Lehi Nephi. That's the land of an original inhabitant, right? But Mosiah, King Mosiah, has come to Harmony. He's found the people there corrupted, but from the same, you know, heritage, and he's able to teach them the truth, and they have crowned him his king. And then, but he's worried about his family in Nephi, Lehi, and so he sent out Ammon and to go find these people and to find out what they're doing. And so that whole dynamic between Mosiah in the Book of Mormon and what's happening in Nephi, Lehi with Zeniff, and then Noah, and then Limhi. This is all describing his own family dynamic, and he's Joseph is traveling back and forth from Harmony to Palmyra, so he is daydreaming along the way. He's saying stories. He's either on the back of a wagon because he's lame, right? He's had leg surgery. He can't walking's not particularly pleasant for him, so he's doing like either hitchhiking or he's taking the stagecoach if he's got enough money. Most of the time he doesn't. So he's busy talking to other travelers. He's looking at the world around him. He's describing the hills where this battle occurred and where these people came down. Like he's world building as he's daydreaming, as he's traveling, and this becomes the basis for lots of the stories in the Book of Mormon. And so that's why I think it's only him. He's influenced by the people he's interacting with, but it revolves around him.
Hmm. So I wanted to just kind of wrap this up a little bit and talk a lot about the early days of the church with the manifestation of tongue speech and Pentecostal experiences, exorcisms going on. This is an idea of the restoration, which is the restoration of all things. And part of that is that impulse that existed in many churches at the time was whether it's Protestantism, which was kind of like, hey, let's get back to the old days, or it's the restorationist movement going on with the Stone Campbellite movement, who want to return to a primitive first century type of church. And one of the more obvious things is that it appears that the gifts of the Spirit are not operational in the modern church world. And so it begs the question, why is this not happening? And now we need to have if you will, a resurgence of the gifts, another Pentecost. And essentially is what we see now with this restoration impulse that's going on, that it appears that the idea was is we want to return to the early days of the church, which included tongue speech. I would like for you to speak to that and also all the other gifts as well.
And as well, yeah, tongue speech is probably the most um, easy to show that trajectory because it's so specific. Glossolalia, which is the idea of speaking in tongues, we're not talking about xenophalia, so the idea of speaking in a foreign, tongue. He's talking about speaking in this God language, and I think this combines a number of things that are going on for Joseph at the time. One is that there's this esoteric world, this ancient esoteric world that Joseph is participating in as world building. And one of the parts of that is these ideas of lost knowledge, and hidden languages. And we see that Joseph is engaged in this idea throughout his life, particularly in the church, of a pure language or an Adamic language that is if we were going to get rid of all the corruption, we'd get back to this pure language that could have power. And the idea of speaking in tongues is related to that. The idea that you could speak in this unknown pure language, which got you access to God in the most beautiful and expressive ways possible. So at the time, how Joseph was in um, was interpreting other churches was that they had a form of godliness, but they denied the source thereof, right? So they pretended to be godly in order to rob the poor of their stuff. And Joseph had been cast out of churches. He was kicked out of Emma's church when he tried to join it after their baby died in 1828. He his Emma's uncle was the Methodist pastor in the area, and yet Joseph and Emma were incredibly poor as they began their marriage and had those terrible tragedies happen, and they didn't get any support from the family. The family kind of cut them off because they didn't appreciate this Book of Mormon thing. To them, it felt like necromancy, right? The idea of consulting with spirits of the dead for they thought it was a cult, so they don't want to support this. That was their thing. From Joseph's point of view, right? He's discovering the pure connection to God through this pure language, through this interaction with heavenly visitors, and he's expressing it in these ways. So one of the ways that he determines that the churches of the day are corrupt is that they are denying God's power. And one of the ways that God's power turns up is in this idea of pure language, glossolalia, speaking in tongues. And so that becomes a really big part of the early church. It's featured in the Book of Mormon, a number of times. It converts a number of people. That's their thing. And Brigham Young speaks in tongues. There's a couple of others who really gravitate towards this. And so in the early church, speaking in tongues is a big converter. The Book of Mormon is, the speaking in tongues is too. And this goes effectively right up through until Kirtland. Kirtland is the Mormon Pentecost. The idea that in the temple there's the rushing, the pouring out of the gifts. There is the speaking in tongues. There is the angelic visitations. There are the bestowal of keys. This is Mormonism's Pentecostal moment, where in the Kirtland Temple, all of these things come to fruition. So it's a really big deal in the early church. It's a really big part of how people are expressing themselves. It's a really big part of how they feel like the church is active. And actually, Joseph is getting lots of revelations. So, people are utilizing that and they're feeling great about that. However, what this looks like in people's actual everyday lives is that they are having their own spiritual witnesses, and some of which are speaking in tongues, and they're feeling incredibly empowered by this. And that's the one thing that speaking in tongues is especially good at, empowering the marginalized. So if you're a woman who might not necessarily have a voice all the time and you're speaking in tongues, suddenly you've got prominence. If you're a person of color and you don't always have a voice, you're speaking in tongues, people are listening. If you're poor, you speak in tongues, somebody who's wealthy might listen to you. These are speaking in tongues speaks to the marginalization that many of the early saints had, and how they felt like they then had a voice. The only downside to this for Joseph was that, of course, these things were really special to the early saints, and they took them to be God's manifestation in their lives, and they often promoted them as the ways that God wanted them to do. And this meant that Joseph, kind of got sidelined, or at least he wasn't always in control of what happened when people got the gift of tongues. So he started to clamp down on this, and this became, as the hierarchy. So it was almost like when it was egalitarian, speaking in tongues was a big deal. Everybody could do it. But once egalitarian didn't work very well for Joseph, and the hierarchy started to go up. The speaking in tongues came down because you can't have somebody who's marginalized usurping the authority of the hierarchy. And so Joseph started to say, okay, well, you can speak in tongues, but it's not authoritative. You can't utilize that for to tell anybody else what to do. You can speak in tongues, but you have to do it at home. You can speak in tongues, but keep it to yourself. Um, Actually, you can't really speak in tongues, and so eventually, by Nauvoo, um, speaking in tongues was fairly eliminated from the general membership of the church because the edicts of sermons and pronouncements by Joseph effectively took over, and um, and Joseph was no longer utilizing speaking in tongues as a form of his authority because he could speak over the pulpit as a sermon. So therefore, speaking in tongues faded away, and there were still some revivals of this. Brigham Young did some speaking in tongues in Utah, um, but effectively, and and of course it's morphed. The biggest speaking in tongues that happens in the church today is testimony meeting on a first Sunday, where people get up and be able to share their voice. And this especially means that the marginalized, those who don't often have a voice, have that one particular sacrament meeting a month to be able to share how spiritual they are. But effectively, speaking in tongues was eliminated from the collective imagination, and it's framed, of course, for missionaries as the idea of being able to speak in a foreign tongue as you go to serve the God by proselyting.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And, I think for people who maybe have been involved in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement, is there a lot of things that sound very familiar to you? Um, Especially people involved in the early days of these movements who will tell you that they might see a lot of parallels going on here. So it's really that's why I love Mormonism so much and why I really appreciate Joseph in many ways is because I identify very closely with the movement, with the people, with the prophet, and I think it's good. I think it's better that we have these positive conversations as opposed to demonizing the other, which is happening and it has poisoned the well in our society and we're unable to have civil conversations. And I'm not going to use Mormon history. I'm not here to weaponize Mormon history against the church. I just think it's really important for people to get out to know the history of the church, the unvarnished, the uncorrelated history. And like as I tell people of the Restoration, so that it's your birthright to know the history of your church, whether it comes from a more secular naturalistic aspect, but I think it's important to view it from that lens. And then it can also help inform your faith as well, which it has mine. And so I'm not afraid. Somebody went to me last year, somebody said, Steve, are you afraid you're going to lose your faith in Jesus? I said, no. And he said, why is that? I said, because I already lost my faith once before. I already know what that's like. I said, it's not something that bothers me anymore. I have a deep abiding faith in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. That's a personal thing. And that's really my testimony. But I also think that there's many, many saints in all the branches of the restoration that love Jesus and want to serve him. And I want to honor those people as well. And I want to honor you, Ganesh, for coming on and telling us about this book that's been a labor of love that you've been doing, and you spent hours and hours researching this, and also consulting with people. And what has this experience been like for you to actually do this journey, to write this book, and how has it helped you in many ways?
So I think when I write, I think when I speak. These, for me personally, as a member of the church, but also and as a person who invests in my community. I in my ward, in my area, I was the bishop. These things are hugely a part of my identity, and so being able to look at it holistically and critically and hopefully at some level of objectivity, but also celebrate the things that it is and the things that it has been and the things that it could be, I think is a part of writing this book. So I hope to answer the question, what is going on and why and how did it end up this way? And I feel like I've been able to give lots of those kinds of answers to these different subjects. Um, and there's still more to do, of course, but you've got to draw a line somewhere and go, okay, this is on paper, and this then puts it out to the world so that people can critically examine, but also hopefully improve. Right? Do I think I have all the answers? Absolutely not. Are there better answers? Absolutely. Um, but this at least gives a mechanism and a framework to go, okay, well, if we this framework works, if we can attach things to it so that it fleshes it out, so that it gives great understanding, then and then that understanding helps for healing for whomever gets marginalized by these particular things, and there are plenty that do. So if it leads to healing, that's I would hope that that's going to be a good thing in the world, and I'm extremely proud of being part of that. In some small measure, and hopefully useful for people who come across it.
Awesome. So it's Joseph Smith, The Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography. Ganesh Cherian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very welcome. It's been a treat, Steve. Great.
And we're going to have links in the description for you to be able to purchase this book. Ganesh, do you have a particular link you would want me to put in there, like Amazon link or any others?
Yeah, so it's easiest to get from Amazon, of course, depending on where on the world you are. That's the beauty of Amazon, is that they'll print on demand and have it to your door in the next few days. No matter where in the world you are, and I happen to be obviously in New Zealand, so those things are really important to me. For those people who are listening in Salt Lake, you can also pick up from Benchmark Books, and obviously there's a print version, but also a a ebook version. So consume it in the ways that it's useful to you. And of course, I put my email address in there. A particular email address just for this book. So if you find the stuff that you either disagree with and you think that there's a better understanding, or there's a better quote or a better reference, or a better an addition that you need to make to the timeline because missed it, there are 1,350 historical data points in this and 1,500 references to LDS scripture. So, even with that, I didn't cover everything. It's
Right.
not possible. So there are definitely holes. There are definitely things that could be better. There are definitely better understandings than I have. But so make this work better, and we'll put out another edition. That's not a problem.
That's great.
With better information.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this is the wonderful thing about living in this age that we can real time make corrections and get better information out there. And I think that's really cool. So we'll have links in the description if you're in the Utah area. Make sure you stop by and say hello to my homies over at Benchmark Books and buy a copy over there. And for those of you who like to financially support the channel, we do of course have links in the description as well. And I want to thank those of you who are supporting the channel. Couldn't do it without you. And remember, the most important thing is this. All the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.